What's up, everybody? I'm Never a Dull Moment. Have you ever wanted to make your own theater room, but you just can't justify the high cost of all the parts and the lengthy setup? Well, it turns out that if you're willing to cut a few corners, you can actually throw it together for pretty dang cheap. This makes for a great place to just hang out with friends, watch movies, play video games, just have a generally large space with a big screen and decent sound, and you really don't have to spend all that much money. Without further ado, I'm going to show you how to make a super cheap home theater setup. Now, the backbone of this setup is using a cheap projector that is not high resolution. Nowadays, we're so spoiled by things like 4K, 8K, and 120 Hz, higher refresh rates, that you can get screens like this for super cheap. I'm actually using a projector that I got about 6 years ago that still works perfectly fine, and I paid about $300 for it back then. Nowadays, there is better value for money available, and I will be linking a whole list of the items that I recommend in the description. Basically, as long as you're going with a reputable manufacturer that's not going to break on you, it's probably going to be fine. Really, all that you need is something that's going to project an image and doesn't really need to have any sort of smart features or super fancy display technology. The one thing I do recommend doing is shying away from the portable projectors that are available. There's a lot of stuff that companies like Anker and LG do, where it's meant to be a small projector that throws an image onto a wall. You get much worse quality from this, even if there is some nice convenience baked in. But if you're going to be cheaping out on a projector, you probably want to get something that's meant to be used in a mounted state and constantly projecting at a wall. Now, you don't absolutely need to have a mounting bracket on your ceiling if you don't want to. You can find a clever place to put it as long as you're able to get the image adjusted to look correct still. But it's something that you may want to consider. Alright, chugging right along, so you have an image that's going up onto your wall, but something that you probably want to keep in mind is doing some kind of treatment to the wall that you're throwing it onto. Regular painted walls like this are going to have a lot of imperfections and bumps and ridges, and that does make the image look worse than it really needs to. If you're willing to spend a little bit more, you can just get a projector screen, which is meant for this type of thing. What I did is just paint the wall gray after sanding it down and smoothing out the wall a little bit. Took a little bit of time, but it was super cheap, and honestly, it looks fantastic. Aside from that, you'll need to power the monitor and grab a long cable. I believe I have a 100-foot cable that is going all the way from my projector back there, looping all the way around through my room, and meeting with the rest of the setup up here. That will connect to something like an HDMI audio extractor. That'll allow you to pull the audio signal out of whatever you're sending to the projector and play it off of speakers that don't suck and aren't that big and behind you. In my perspective, if you're going to go through the work of throwing up a huge screen on the wall, you might as well have a decent audio setup, and you can actually do this without spending a whole lot of money. Believe it or not, bookshelf speakers are still some of the best way to get really good sound without spending a ton of money, and there are a couple of different options you can use for this. What I have is the Mica MB42 speakers connected to a very cheap receiver that I found at a thrift store that has been working absolutely fine. Soundbars might be really small and look nice, but they just don't really come close to producing clear dialogue, good bass, and overall satisfying sound, especially if you're in a larger room. So your money is definitely better spent getting something like bookshelf speakers, but if you really want to cheap out, you can use pretty much anything you want because the audio extractor will output to a aux cable. So you can hook up your Bluetooth speaker if you want to. Now, you are going to want to have some kind of a coffee table or a holder for the stuff that you're going to have, because behind this area is where I have that long cable that plugs into some kind of a streaming stick. You can use a Roku, a Fire TV, or even if you have an Xbox or something like that, you can just use that to play things like Netflix. But that's going to be where you have your speakers, maybe a receiver if you go that route, your console itself, and just hide the wires away so things aren't going to look super duper ugly. So without further ado, let's just show you what this super cheap setup actually looks like in practice.
Never meant to make her cry. Now I'm seeing tears in her eyes.
Alright, so this all looks like a really fun idea, but you might have a few questions now that I've presented this whole idea to you. Number one, do you need to have a pitch black room to actually use this thing? Well, one of the trade-offs that we're making with this setup is with having a cheap projector and just a painted wall, or maybe not even painted, you do want to keep the room as dark as possible. Ambient light will have a pretty big impact when you don't have a specific screen that's for a projector, and if your projector has pretty low brightness to begin with. So that's one of the trade-offs you make. You can get a nicer projector or invest in a decent movie screen, and that will help things out a lot, but you still want to try and keep the room pretty dark when you're using this setup. Number two, I did put some emphasis on saying how I like these kind of bookshelf speakers. That is really the preferable option. Really, any kind of higher end audio system is going to be based around something more like this rather than a sound bar or some smaller solution like a Bluetooth speaker. This kind of thing is really not difficult or expensive to set up. It just takes a little bit more time than you might spend plugging a soundbar into a wall and then plugging that into your system. So these are the Mica MB42X speakers. These would just plug into any receiver which would power them and make them produce sound. You could also go with something like a powered monitor, which just means that rather than having to have your own receiver, you can just plug directly into the system and it's a lot easier to set up. The advantage of having a receiver like this is that you can upgrade speakers, you can upgrade the receiver, you can throw in surround sound later on, and you don't have to ditch the old stuff that you were using before. It's also worth noting that with the setup that I've linked in the description, you only do have one HDMI input. So that means if you're going to be switching between different consoles or that kind of thing, you are going to have to actually unplug it and plug it back in. Cheap and easy way around this is just to get something like an HDMI splitter, which will give you access to multiple different inputs. Or you could just use something like a PS4 or an Xbox that's going to do all of your Netflix and Hulu and video games and YouTube and all that sort of stuff. If you're not a gamer though, or you don't have one of those consoles, the easiest thing to do is just get a Roku stick or a Fire Stick, something like that, which will allow you to play content on the projector. It's also worth noting that with my specific setup, you do actually have to get up and adjust the volume yourself. Now there are solutions like powered monitors that come with a remote that allow you to adjust the volume without getting up, or you can use a soundbar, or with certain applications you can just stream content to the screen and then use your phone to adjust the volume just with your volume buttons right there. So really this is a pretty fun and easy project. It will take a little bit of time to set up, but you'll use it all the time, and it's a really fun way to get your friends together, play games, watch movies, listen to music, whatever you want. I'm never a dull moment, and I'll see you guys around.